Hello, Devlin here, and welcome to the Devlin Bishop Show. And I have got the lovely Corta with me. How are you today?
Pretty good. How about you?
I'm good. I always love recording this show, whatever we're talking about, but I get more giddy when we talk with a guest. And we have got a guest today, and this is his first time on the podcast, though I've chatted many times about different topics, mostly music, because he's a music guy. And we are going to talk a little bit about the 70s. And recently we had a 70s watch party, a little thing called the Time Warp. And by all means, if you have never attended one of our watch parties, and maybe you only see us on YouTube, so if you don't, subscribe to our Facebook channel and you can always be up to date on when we show these parties. We've been doing it almost every other week, and we can do everything from online dance parties. We just started doing movie nights. And one of the things we do is a thing called the Time Warp, where we go for 2 hours to a different era. And we've already done the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. We're definitely going back. And our my first guest and I talked a little bit about the 70s, and we decided to do a whole show talking about the musical styles of the 70s. And he is a host of a really awesome jazz show called Jazz in Session. I'll let him do the plug for you eventually. I just want to get his smiling, handsome face on the screen. Here's Karim Mosna, our guest today. There he is. And
Nice.
welcome to the show. This is always the awkward moment because we've already chatted, but we have to make it look like this is the first time I've seen him in years. But I was just explaining to him that we recently had a 70s time warp where we spent 2 hours in the 70s, and we talked a little bit about it. And that's kind of how we kind of got into wanting to talk about music in the 70s. But before we get that, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. It's a beautiful day, and I'm just relaxed, have a warm cup of tea, and yeah, just ready to chill a bit. So,
I mentioned that you are the host of Jazz in Session, but do you want to give a proper plug for it before we get right into the meat of the 70s?
oh, for sure. Yes, I'm the host of Jazz in Session. It's a syndicated radio program that is heard on 101.5 The Hawk out of Hamilton and reaches the Hamilton, Burlington surrounding areas. And that's heard Wednesday mornings 10 to noon. It's also heard Wednesday evenings from 6 to 8 on CFRU 93.3 out of Guelph.
That's awesome. How long have you been doing the show for?
This will be my now I did miss a year somewhere in between, but in total, I started 10 years ago.
Nice.
Yeah,
Nice.
a
And have you
decade.
always had a love of jazz?
Yes, I certainly that's kind of the first music I heard as a child. Of course, as we get more into this discussion, we'll soon discover how my musical tastes, grew and broadened, and have certainly stretched out in pretty well every direction, every era, pretty much every era. There's something I dig. So yeah,
Awesome. And we
yeah.
won't waste too much time. We'll get right into it. But let's
Hmm.
clear something up right now.
Sure.
For those of you watching, I grew up in the 70s. I want to say I was very young, but I heard a lot of the music we're going to probably talk about firsthand.
Hmm.
And Kareem is a youngin,
Hmm.
and you were not born in the 70s or did not hear this music firsthand.
I did not hear it when it was new. Let's put it that way.
Right. Yeah, I
Yeah.
like to clear that up. I like to let people know the generational thing because I think it's good, not just to tell people I'm old. Heather is younger than me, but she was born in the 70s,
Yes.
right?
But I don't
But
really know any of the music from
no,
when it
no,
was.
I introduced her to pretty much most of the music she listens
Yeah.
to. But I like people to know that because I think younger people are discovering music of different generations now, and it's really nice. And it's funny because a lot of people think just because I'm older that I don't know a lot of new music, but I
Mhm.
actually surprised them that I like to actually literally go out and search for music. And
Hmm.
sometimes I wind up stumbling on stuff from eras that I didn't know. So
Yeah.
I love meeting new people. And when they introduce me stuff, I'm like always thankful for they did. So we are talking 70s today. And what was your take on the 70s? Like when you first got into the 70s, what style of music do you think you learned about first?
First, it would have to be more on the rock side first. You know, I remember, when I was a little kid, kind of, strolling around the radio, just kind of curious, and and hearing stuff like Pink Floyd for the first time, Bohemian Rhapsody
Yeah.
by Queen, The Who, stuff like that. Um, and this kind of stuff, it's like, what on earth is this? Right?
Hmm.
Because it like nothing I had known previously.
No, yeah, some of that
Yeah.
classic rock was
Hmm.
like you listen to it now and it
Hmm.
seems almost like orchestra, like it's created like it's written like, classical music when you hear it now and stuff. And I
Uh-huh.
think that's why a lot of young people are attracted to it because I think when people hear the 70s, like if I
Hmm.
said music of the 70s, a lot of people will go to either disco or
Hmm.
classic rock. Those are
Sure.
your two things. But every era has, and that's the thing I love, is
Hmm.
because when I grew up, we had a top 40 radio station. And I think I've told you this before, Kareem, and probably to many of my audience before. When
Hmm.
I grew up, I had a top 40 station that played different styles of music, and it was the top 40. It was the big hits. So growing up, I didn't know the difference between Donna Summer and Queen and AC/DC because they were all played on the same station. To me, it was
Yeah.
pop music. And
Right.
I loved all of it. Hey, Kenny Rogers, just the same as listening to like James Taylor or, Alice Cooper. And so when I got older and realized that there were all these genres, I thought, oh, well, I'm kind of glad I grew up not knowing that because when I was young, it was just music. And I love that about
Hmm.
the 70s. But now when I look at it, and especially like when I had to find 2 hours of 70s music, I think a lot of people, if they did it, they may have stayed with only a couple of genres, but you were there for my night. I tried to
Uh-huh.
get bubblegum pop in there, which was
Yeah.
big. I tried to get disco. I tried to get some hard rock, some glam rock. I tried to get some folk. So I try to, and it's hard. So that's why I look forward to revisiting all those decades again, because there was so much I had to leave out and stuff like that. So, what was your favorite style out of the 70s that you discovered?
Well, I mean, since then, I've been exposed to so much more than just, one aspect, as we've been touching on. And I mean, there was so much you could draw from. I mean, you mentioned a couple, of the singer-songwriters from that era. I mean, that era gave us some of the greatest singer-songwriters,
Absolutely.
like James Taylor, like Van Morrison, Cat Stevens. And I mean, this is
Carole
timeless.
King, Elton
Car-
John. Yeah.
Carole King, thank you. Yeah, I was just listening to the Tapestry album a few weeks ago, and
Oh,
just incredible.
it's funny.
Yeah.
Tapestry was something I actually discovered later in life. I knew some of the hits and uh, heartbreaking songs, like so beautifully crafted. And she wrote so many great hits in the 60s for people. And then
Yes.
she does this album that is groundbreaking. It's too late and so far
Mm-hmm.
away. And the whole album is just phenomenal. I'm more of a singles guy, but that is an album I can put on and listen to the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so many and like just different styles too that are just mind blowing. And that's a good place to start because that kind of kicked off the early 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that came because of like they were kind of like it's almost like a uh, folk adult contemporary that kind of
Mm-hmm.
built into the classic rock. And I think we got that because of the Beatles and Simon and Garfunkel at the end of
Mhm.
the 60s, who
Mhm.
were now getting to write like more personal feeling songs, you know. The 50s and 60s have some great music and stuff, but there was a lot of
Mhm.
fun music and stuff. Not saying the 70s, we'll touch
Oh
on
yeah.
that too. But when
Yeah.
we'll start with this era, and the
Mhm.
singer-songwriter phase is incredible. And looking back at it, it is so amazing. And yeah, do you have any personal favorites from like that folk kind of James Taylor kind of
Oh,
Jim
I mean, well,
Croce? I
oh,
always hate when I miss
Jim
people.
Croce, of
So
course.
many.
Yeah, Jim Croce. Oh, absolutely. Some beautiful stuff he did, like Time in a Bottle and I Got a Name and
Oh,
Operator, and yeah, Don McLean, of course. Who, yes, American Pie, but he also had some other great,
oh,
beautiful songs like Vincent as well.
Vincent.
Yeah.
Vincent is heartbreaking.
Oh, it
And
is.
when I was growing up, this is a little conceited here, but when I was
Mhm.
growing up, I actually thought he was singing to me, even though he
Wow.
said the
Yeah, yeah.
name Vincent, because he. My God, I'm getting emotional already about the 70s.
Yeah.
But when I was like a kid, I listened to the lyrics and I thought he's singing to me, and that's why I think these singer songwriters are so incredible, because I think people were starting to show more emotion in songs. And yeah, and like, I'm not saying there weren't emotions before that, but I'm saying they got more personalized. Like, I'm going to sing for myself, and that's going to translate to other people. And I think
Yeah.
that's why people are still endeared to like Elton John's and stuff like that. And when you mention Elton John, you got to mention Bernie Taupin, because I was blown away when I
Yeah.
found out that Elton didn't even write his lyrics.
Yeah.
I was a lot younger when I found that out, but he wrote the music, which is just incredible. But I always just thought Elton must have wrote all this stuff and that too. So, but it was nice because the 70s kind of, there was a lot of stuff at the beginning of the 70s. Now I was a little kid, so I remember a little bit of it, but there was this wonderful adult contemporary folk kind of feel with those songs. And like last night, me and my partner were listening to the Carpenters,
Oh, yeah.
and Karen Carpenter gets, is considered one of the greatest vocalists, like her voice.
Mhm.
But we forget just how much they did, and Richard Carpenter doesn't get as much love either. And he wrote some of their songs. They did do a lot of other people's songs, but I love that they had their own style. They never tried to be hip. Karen would always look like, I'm just gonna buy a random dress. She didn't try
Mhm.
to like glitter it up like Cher or anything like that.
Yeah.
And I love that they had some really cheesy songs too, like
Oh,
Top of the
Top
World.
of the World was been playing in my head as we started talking about them. Yeah, that's the one that comes.
And you know
Uh,
what? I get
yeah.
excited because it was funny because I like to
Yeah.
analyze songs, and
Uh-huh.
they have so many more beautiful songs. But Top of the
Mhm.
World, whenever I hear that
Oh
cheesy
yeah.
organ, like bam, 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 bam,
Hmm.
I get
Hmm.
excited. But some of the lyrics in that, and that is a Richard Carpenter song. He
Right.
wrote
Right.
that. But some of the lines in that, like on the top of the world, looking down on creation. What a line. Like, to me, that is a powerful lyric. It just blows me away and stuff. So, but yeah, and it was wonderful to see that this adult contemporary kind of sometimes into rock and stuff,
Sure.
and how it's lasted so long. And
Hmm.
also at the beginning of the 70s, I don't know if you got this in your notes, but we also had bubblegum pop.
It's funny. I associate that more with the earlier '60s personally, but I suppose there was a was it the Archie Sugar Sugar kind of thing?
That was at the end of the 60s
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
stuff. But
Hmm.
bubblegum pop and kind of formed sort of into like glam rock too. But
Okay.
early days, you had like the Bay City Rollers, which was like
Bay City.
one of
Yeah.
the, a big teen band. Like,
Hmm.
a lot of people don't think of the Beatles and the Beach Boys as a teen band, but teens love them, so I guess they are.
Hmm.
But when you think of like stuff like boy bands, you think of like New Kids on the Block or something, or In Sync or Backstreet Boys. But Bay City Rollers were a phenomenon.
Yeah. They. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
this
They
Scottish band of, cute guys who were singing bubblegum pop, and they just took the 70s by storm. And, we recently lost the lead singer, Les
Yeah, Les
McCune.
McEwen, I believe. Yeah, just
Yeah.
passed a week ago. Yeah.
And it's funny because they were always a band that I was a little kid, but my brothers were older. And my older brother was a fan, and all the girls in our neighborhood were fans. But when you were a guy, you couldn't admit you liked it, even though.
Okay.
And one of my favorite stories was I saw an interview with one of the Ramones, and
Mhm.
they were asked if their Blitzkrieg Bop, where they're like, "Hey, oh, let's go," and stuff like that, was inspired by Saturday Night because they had that
Okay.
SATUR. And the Ramones kind of just were like, "We're not going to admit to that." But everybody
Wow.
wanted a chant song after
Yeah.
Saturday Night.
Also, yeah, that song was certainly influential in its way, I
Mhm.
suppose. Okay.
Absolutely. And it
Yeah.
broke them wide
Oh,
and
for sure.
suddenly became huge and stuff. But bubblegum did stay at the beginning
Okay.
of the 70s because we had a lot of little novelty songs in the 70s too. And then, that kind of went into glam rock and stuff like that. So, were you a fan of glam rock, or is that something you've gotten into?
Well, glam rock, interesting. So it's interesting that, exactly who you would put in that. I mean, David Bowie comes to mind.
Yes.
But David Bowie's, in terms of, you name it, he probably did it in terms of a style.
Yeah, he's a chameleon, yeah.
Exactly. Then there's
But he definitely started glam rock. Like he was in that with like T-Rex and Sweet. I would put
T-Rex.
that.
Oh yeah, T-Rex, good example. Yeah, but yeah, definitely, as Ziggy Stardust was kind of the glam definitive moment, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And T-Rex was great and Sweet, like you said, like with the is it Fox on the Run's a great tune, and
And again,
yeah.
these were stuff my brothers would play or it'd be on the radio, and I didn't
Sure.
know what glam rock was. But when I started, because we didn't like in the '80s, it was easier to, because back in the '70s we had radio,
Sure.
and you would buy an album, and that's how you would see the group.
Mm.
But in the '80s, we got videos, so you got to see groups, and you got to, see. That's, how the whole video killed the radio star, because a lot of,
Exactly. Yeah.
because it was like suddenly you had to be good looking as well. Didn't hurt. Where in the '70s, you could have somebody who, maybe okay looking, but they were musicians, and they
Mm.
weren't judged just on, hey, they're good looking kind of thing.
Huh. Great point for sure.
But so when I looked at glam rock, it was weird because when I heard Sweet, I never thought that they used to, wear makeup and stuff like that. Even like Todd Rundgren
Oh yeah.
used to wear big makeup and stuff like that. And that's a guy who doesn't get the love he deserves.
Absolutely, in terms of, well, I mean, his own music, but also the vast production that he did as
Absolutely.
well.
He
Yeah,
keeps
Todd
getting into the
Rundgren's
Hall
great.
of. Yeah, they keep putting him in the nominees for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he never makes it. He's like, he's got to make it eventually, just for based on the production
Well, I can
side
tell
of
you that
stuff.
he was among my votes this time around. So
Nice, excellent. Do you get to vote in that?
anyone can vote.
Oh, I did not know
You've
that.
got one more week to vote. Yes, at
I
the
will
Rock
have to
Hall's
look into
website.
that. Well, I'll have to go put some votes in, but Olivia never gets nominated, so
Okay. Yeah.
she needs to be in there. And
Oh, absolutely,
we'll
for
talk
sure.
about her because
Hmm.
she was definitely part of the '70s too. But yeah, glam rock is kind of mixed in with that and stuff like that. And then we started getting into the prog rock.
Hmm.
That's where you got into your I'm going blank. Um,
Yes.
yes, that's
Where you have your, if a piece is only 10 minutes, it's short with yes. That's the thing.
and Emerson, Lake and Palmer,
Oh,
and
yeah.
even early Genesis.
Genesis is exactly how much their music shifted from the start of the decade to the end of the decade.
And it's I love watching. You probably do too. Watching
Yep.
documentaries, reading
Yep.
books.
Hmm.
And I remember them always saying that, and I always said that Peter Gabriel leaving Genesis
Hmm.
was probably beneficial to both groups Like,
Okay.
do you know what I mean? Like, they were making incredible music all together. But
Hmm.
when he left, that's when his solo career came. And then Genesis found like a more pop niche to it.
Yep. Hmm.
And then eventually Phil Collins, in the 80s going off on his own. So Genesis got bigger because I remember they always said that when they released Follow Me, Follow You,
Follow you, follow me.
yes,
Yes.
that's it.
Hmm.
They said that was the first time they started noticing women coming out to their concerts because
Oh
they had
wow.
talent, where it was mostly these guys that were like, yeah,
Uh,
prog rock. And now it's like, oh, we need to write music to get the ladies out.
they found a new audience.
And a lot of groups
Yeah.
changed their sound because of that.
Hmm.
Like, if you actually, like, I was blown away when you go look into early Fleetwood Mac.
Yeah.
Some people would think, like, Rumors is early Fleetwood Mac, but
Not
they
at all. Nope.
60s. They were doing stuff in the late 60s, and it's so different. And then they added female vocalists and started doing pop stuff and
Hmm.
rock. And yeah, and I love seeing that. The Doobie Brothers, Dr. Hook are all people that,
Hmm.
and I think it came down to necessity because you had
Sure.
to decide, do you want to, I don't know if they were forced into it by their record companies. I don't know. Do
Hmm.
you have thoughts on that? Because it almost seemed like, okay, it's great that you got the critics loving your progressive rock, but we want you to sell albums now.
Well, and singles too, right?
Singles, right?
You want if you want to get on the singles charts and
Right.
get to number one, right? You don't want, instead of, a 10-minute piece, right, is great for the hardcore lovers of the music, right? Like a hardcore, but if you want to get, a number one hit, it's got to be under four. There's a Billy Joel lyric about it's got to be 305 to be a
Yes.
hit. Yeah. So that kind of
Well,
thing. Yeah.
absolutely. And we even had to get radio edits of like Inagata Davida to get it played.
Yeah.
I always knew the short version, and then one day I was like, oh, that's a long song when you listen to the album.
A whole album side.
Right. Same
Yeah.
with like Tubular Bells, which was in the 70s,
Oh,
which,
by Mike Oldfield. Yes.
right, which is a weird song when you, like, it's a
Hmm.
great song, but you don't think of it as being something that was played on the top 40, but it
Sure.
was because they had
Yeah.
to do an edit of it. And it still gets played around
Oh yeah.
Halloween a lot because it was the
Absolutely.
Exorcist theme.
Hmm.
And it's such a beautiful piece of music, but it's so random. And that was one of the things I loved about growing up in the 70s, that
Hmm.
there was so much randomness.
Yeah.
Like, as I said, you could listen to the top 40 and you're listening to like Jim Croce and you're
Hmm.
listening to like the Doobie Brothers.
Yeah.
And then Ray Stevens can have The Streak go to number one, like a novelty song about
Hmm.
getting naked and running.
I
And
know.
people were like, yeah, we got to do that.
It only would have happened back then. That's for sure. Yeah.
And that's what I love is that,
Yeah.
like, we're just hitting and we're still talking about different genres and stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and uh, and the classic rock, I think, is what probably holds up the best because
Hmm.
they actually say classic rock still outsells a lot of new music to this day.
Okay. Well, that's also a big part of the vinyl resurgence, I would think
Yes,
too. I mean, that's
that's
if you're starting a record collection, who are you going to start with, right?
absolutely, and that's another funny thing. That's a whole different
Hmm.
episode.
Yeah, it
Is
could
I
be.
remember all these people getting rid of their albums when CDs showed up, and
Hmm.
now here we are
Hmm.
trying to get them back again.
Hmm.
And those few people that were smart enough to say, "I'm keeping mine just in case," and it's funny to see albums. And now you can buy a brand new version of an album and pay ridiculous amounts of money when we were buying them for like $6.99 for an album and stuff like that. And I started buying music in the 70s. Up till then, it was all the radio, or I'd listen to my brother when he was in a good mood and let me listen to his 45s and stuff. But the first albums I bought were in the 70s. So when people tell me, what was the first 45 you bought? I can say it was in the 70s.
Hmm.
I've talked about it in the past. It was Donna Summers' Last Dance. I loved it very much when I was getting into my pop and disco phases and stuff like that. and we will definitely get around to disco,
Oh yeah.
because I know you're a disco fan like I am, and I am so glad the disco got past, um, because it was hated by the end of the decade, and like to the point where people were destroying disco albums. And yet, what I always loved was that it still technically survived because there were pop artists still releasing disco. They were just not calling it disco, you know.
Okay.
But it was so loved at the beginning, and disco started a lot earlier than a lot of people think. A lot of people thought it was R&B, funk, and stuff, but I remember hearing stuff like "Rock the Boat" in like '74 or something, '73, '74. It just didn't become more mainstream until the middle to late '70s and stuff like that. And yeah, I absolutely adore disco, and I'm glad it gets love now. Because in the '80s, to put on a disco song, people would be like turning up their nose, and now you put it on and people are on the dance floor. Give me some more Casey and the Sunshine Band,
Yes.
and stuff like that. And it was good because funk and disco kind of fused, and it made for a wonderful thing. You think you would have been hitting the discos if you were that age in the '70s?
It's funny. It's hard to say because, again, as you mentioned, now we're embracing it. But it's funny. It's sometimes when it's all around you, you're kind of like, too much. But
Yeah.
now we can look back on it from a bit of a distance and appreciate it in a new way. And I mean, we can maybe even hear something in it. Maybe we uh, when there's that distance in a way, now we do listen back to songs like "Rock the Boat" that you talked about by Hughes Corporation, and or um, Disco Inferno and great stuff like that, and we just see, wow, these groups were so talented.
Yeah, and what I love about looking at disco is looking back at it is a lot of these songs were like considered throwaways, like they were top 40 songs. People enjoyed it, they loved dancing to it. But now you can look back and see the artistry in a
Mhm.
lot of it. And I guess you can do that with any era and stuff. And it's always neat to see what survives and what is kind of like, oh, I sort of remember that and stuff like that. But a lot of disco, I think, gets looked on now. Like, I think the people that got hit hardest because of disco was
Sorry, say that, the Bee Gees, did you
the
say?
Bee Gees.
Yes, yes.
Because when they started, they were actually having hit songs like
Mhm.
kind of folk, adult contemporary, stuff
Right.
like "How Can You Mend a Broken Heart," and like just really great songs like "Words," and
Massachusetts,
"Started a
yeah.
Joke." And then what happened was, I always call it the genie in the bottle. Barry Gibb found his falsetto,
Hmm.
and Jive Talkin' was born. And that basically changed the course of them, and not necessarily in a bad way. And then they blew up bigger because of Saturday Night Fever when they were asked to do that album. And that it was one of the biggest albums. I've got a list here of the biggest albums of the '70s. It still ranks at number 5. And it became huge. But at the same time, a lot of people blame Saturday Night Fever for killing it because now it went totally mainstream. Remember, disco was kind of respected a little bit. I don't know if you agree with that because it was underground. Songs that were on the
Okay.
dance club were like still, you had to go to the dance club to hear them. And then occasionally we'd get some top 40 crossover. But sometimes it would take a long time to go from the dance club. But Saturday Night Fever had like your parents now wanting to learn how to do the hustle and
Right.
boogie.
So it lost its culture. It became just everywhere.
And you made a
Yeah.
good point. You said you
Uh-huh.
don't know because it was everywhere. You made a great point when you said, I don't know if
Mhm.
I would have embraced it as much because suddenly, and other groups you noticed were starting to do disco songs that,
Rod Stewart, for example.
yes, he went from like Maggie May to Do You Think
Hmm.
I'm Sexy? The
Hmm.
one I always say is Kiss.
I was made for loving you.
You know what?
Yeah.
They did not like disco, and they basically said we could do a disco song. And I consider I Was Made for Loving You one of the best Kiss songs. I think
Okay.
it's so well produced, and I still get excited when I hear that music
Oh yeah,
start.
when that intro comes in for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember like there was even some embarrassing disco out there because I remember like
Disco Duck.
yeah, Disco Duck, which was a #1 single. I actually preferred his follow-up, Disco Rilla. I always got to give a shout out to Disco Rilla because it's the exact same song, but I like the monkey moves more than the quack
Mm.
quacks. If you get a chance, definitely check it out.
Mm.
I think Disco Rilla is superior to Disco Duck. But then you started getting like, Ethel
Mm.
Merman. She had a disco album.
Ethel Merman. She was mainly known more in musical theater, I would, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
like she
Yes.
did, like one of her big songs. If you ever want to, well, one day when this pandemic's over, we got to get together and listen to some music because I got some strange stuff I'd love to share with you. But she had her famous song was "There's No Business Like Show Business."
Right.
And you haven't lived till you heard the disco version of that with her like, "There's
Oh.
no business like show," and she doesn't even try to hide it. It's just like
Mm.
that. There was an "I Love Lucy" theme disco song, which is incredible.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and it's just the theme over and over again. And every once in a while they go like, "Dance, dance, disco Lucy," and
Oh.
just anything was becoming disco.
I
Like,
think there
and
was a Star Wars too. I think you included it in the last Time Warp.
I did.
Yeah.
Miko, who was
Mhm.
a really big European, I think he was a synthesizer guy. He asked if he could do and he struck while it was hot because Star Wars came out in like May, and I think that was playing on the like by August.
Yeah.
And he was smart, and he did other ones. He did a disco version of The Wizard of Oz, which is incredible.
Oh
But what was
wow.
weird, yeah, it's weird because it sounds almost like the Star Wars one, and you never
Hmm.
realize how close Over the Rainbow and Star Wars actually sound, even though
Hmm.
they had other issues with that. But that's a whole other story. They got dealt with lawsuits because a lot of people thought Star Wars sounded like Born Free, which was another 70s early hit.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, there was like everybody was doing disco, and I think that's when disco kind of started dying. One of my big favorite jokes is that the Grammys debuted Best Disco Recording in 1979, and it was the only year it was given out because by 80 disco was a dirty word.
And who won?
It was "I Will Survive" by Gloria Gaynor. Is the
Well
only
deserved. Yeah.
Yes, and which is funny because it's called "I Will Survive," and it
Oh,
didn't.
and I didn't.
But it survived because
Uh-huh.
it's now looked on as such an anthem. But yeah, it was the only Grammy given out for best disco because by the 80s they had to change it to like dance or R&B or dance or something. But I love that trivia fact, and it is well deserved because that is a classic. But then you think artists like the Bee Gees suffered from it because in the 80s it took them a while to get back with music saying, look,
Yeah.
we were doing other kind of music before disco, but they were just suddenly because they were such big sellers. But other people kind of survived it, like Earth, Wind and Fire,
Hmm.
which were looked more as like a groundbreaking funk, jazz, like they fuse
Yeah.
so much, like pop. And I recently read that in Rolling Stone magazine, they said that Earth, Wind and Fire is like was groundbreaking for black pop music and taking funk to new levels and stuff. And then we also got like Kool and the Gang, who had many hits in the 80s. And it was funny because as I said, they slipped disco into the 80s, but they didn't call it disco. You hear something from 81 like Super Freak, that is a disco song, but
Oh, no
as long as
question.
you don't call
Yeah.
it disco.
Uh-huh.
So disco became like a dirty word. So as
Mhm.
long as you didn't call it disco, Kool and the Gang could still have hits in
Mhm.
the 80s, but sadly, groups like the Bee Gees and Casey and the Sunshine Band, their careers all came crashing down around the 80s. And I'm glad when we look back now, the Bee Gees are regarded as like some of the greatest singer songwriters out there, and even their disco music like is considered up there. Staying Alive,
Hmm.
Night Fever, How Deep Is Your Love? Like you got to remember, in the '70s, there was a year, I think it was '78, that the Bee Gees had like the top 5 songs.
Right, and then I think I heard there was then Andy Gibb had a big hit that year too.
Right, and
Um,
he was in
yeah.
there. They
Hmm.
had 2 songs in there. Andy Gibb, their younger brother, had
Hmm.
one in there. Samantha Sang had
Right.
Emotion, which was them, and
Hmm.
blatantly the Bee Gees doing backup on that. And then
Yeah.
I think If I Can't Have You, the Yvonne Elliman version, which was
Right.
on the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, which was released by her. In fact, you got both versions on that. And so the Bee Gees at one time were like, people wanted to do Bee Gees songs. And then in the '80s, it kind of washed up. They still had some hits for other people, but it's sad that it took them a while. And what I was always surprised about is that when they did the awful, well, awful but good sequel to Saturday Night Fever, the Bee Gees agreed to do it, even though it wasn't disco music. And I was surprised because I would assume they'd want nothing to do with Staying Alive. I thought, hey, good on them that they took a chance and wanted to show we can do '80s music. Unfortunately, they didn't have any big hits from it, but but they did have a couple of hits near the end of their career, and a lot of people celebrated them. So I consider the Bee Gees like up there with the Eagles and like some of the bigger groups. We'll talk about what some of our favorite big groups of the. We still
Sure.
have a couple of. Do you have any other different styles of music that you want to talk about? Because I know I
Well,
still have a couple we need to talk about.
well, I think what's also interesting is it was also the time when reggae reached sort of, I guess you could say, mass
Nice.
conscious awareness.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, absolutely. And Bob Marley
Hmm.
really started getting a lot more play,
Yes.
as in more people were discovering his music. And yeah, and other artists like Jimmy Cliff
Hmm.
were starting to. They were still underground, but you're right. The '70s, we saw a lot more of that surging up, and I think when you talk about reggae, a lot of people do mention some of the albums from the '70s of that, and yeah, and that's a great one to mention because I totally forgot that. That's the wonderful thing about all doing stuff like the time warp and stuff. What I love is you start finding that there's a lot. Like when I put together the '90s, I thought this one would be hard, and I was still finding so many different
Yeah.
varieties of music. It wasn't all grunge and Lilith Fair type music. There was a lot of stuff, and the '70s I just think were just one of my favorite decades. Like I could talk hours about
Yeah.
different music that inspired me. I know when we're done here, I'm going to say, I can't believe I didn't mention Baker Street or Night Moves or
Oh yeah. That's again getting Jerry Rafferty and Bob Seger. Yeah.
yeah, Bruce Springsteen.
Oh, but I was just thinking about this the other day about like how great Born to Run sounds
Absolutely.
to
And
this day. Yeah.
yeah, Thunder Road, like,
Thunder Road. Oh
and
yes.
it's funny because even being brought up in the '70s, I
Hmm.
actually became a Bruce Springsteen fan in the '80s with the Born in the USA album.
Oh, because
But
that
then
was
when I read,
massive. Hmm.
yeah, that was where he exploded because he went from like a classic rock guy, and now he was right up there with like it was weird because he was always part of the rock scene, and now he was on MTV with Madonna and Michael Jackson and Duran Duran,
Hmm.
and all because he wrote this iconic album and basically blew up with. He went from this skinny little rocker guy to this muscular guy that was like, oh my god! And but his early start, I going back, I found his music in the '70s, and it's so amazing to see that butterfly cocoon thing. You always see that with lots of things. We talked about it with the Bee Gees, but Bruce Springsteen. And Bruce Springsteen, I think, is there are a couple of artists, and another one from the '70s is Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band.
Hmm.
These are groups that I always loved their songs, but as I get older, I get the meanings of the songs.
I have the same experience personally.
Right.
Yeah, like yeah, some of the artists you just mentioned, yeah, from Bob Seger to Bruce
It's an
Springsteen.
amazing feeling, right?
I think for me, Neil Young is a big one
Yeah, Neil,
in terms of
absolutely.
when you start to resonate. And I think it could have something to do with the stage in life they were at when they wrote them.
Absolutely.
And kind of when you're getting around that stage or a little bit older, a little bit younger, give or take, and you have those experiences to relate to more.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Hmm.
that's what it is. So, like a song like Night Moves, when you hear
Hmm.
that as a kid, you realize, like, you think of it as, oh, they're making out in the car and all about, like, teen sex
Uh,
and stuff like that. So
it's
I
great
was
imagery. Yep.
it's beautiful imagery.
Hmm.
And I don't think I respected the imagery. I just thought that's a cool song until I
Hmm.
listened to the lyrics. And I remember that moment when I'm like, this is about having sex. And then when you get older, you realize it's about reminiscing about those times.
Very
So
good point. Hmm.
right. And I always say this with groups like, well, he's more 80s, but John Cougar I throw in there too.
Yes,
Mellencamp.
a lot of his songs are looking back at youth or at adolescence.
Right.
Yeah.
So uh, going into the 80s for a minute, Bruce can sing about glory days and I can rock along with it as a teenager. But when I get to hit 50, I'm like, oh, I get it, Bruce. This song's even better than I thought it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's funny how we take that. And I think that's why we're so nostalgic about stuff.
Hmm.
I recently watched something that I loved. It was a
Yeah.
young guy who was who asked why older music is better than the stuff they released now,
Hmm.
like on the top 40 right now. And he's this guy is a young guy, and he said and he loves a lot of older stuff, and he said I think it's not really fair to say that because all these older things have had decades.
Hmm.
So a group like the Bee Gees or Jim Croce may not have been respected as much in the '70s, but because we've had so many years with them. So ask me in 30 years that there might be a Bruno Mars song or a Rihanna song or, Dua Lipa
Hmm.
that may actually live the test of times.
Yeah.
But we just will not know that because what happens is we're talking a lot about great '70s songs, but there's a lot of stuff that doesn't get talked about in the '70s because we kind of weeded out what we now like culture says is the best of the best. And they've had that many
Okay.
years. And I respected that he said that, and I'm gonna remember that. And that's what I always think, because
He's
sometimes
very
I'll hear
wise.
a song. Yeah, and I hear a song and I can say, that's gonna last. Like
Hmm.
and I know, and the new music is out there. You just got
Hmm.
to find it. When I first heard Uptown Funk, I said, "This is going to stand." My
Hmm.
grandchildren will be listening to Uptown Funk still, and people will be comparing it to like Earth, Wind, and Fire and Michael Jackson and all that
Uh-huh.
stuff. So, but another thing that we must mention, there's
Hmm.
still a couple. We're probably going to miss tons, but
Okay.
country had a huge surge in the '70s and
It,
died in the '80s and then came back in the '90s again.
it
But we got to remember that country crossed over into the '70s because in the '50s and '60s, country was huge.
yes.
But in the '70s, country crossed over. And that's when we started getting Kenny Rogers and early Olivia Newton John.
Hmm.
So suddenly the folk scene was bringing out country acts. That's why groups like the Eagles are respected in rock and country because
Yes.
you can put on an Eagles song and you can put on a Kenny Rogers song and it fits and flows so well, because early Doobie Brothers can fit
Hmm.
into that southern rock, and that's
Very
another
true.
genre right there, southern rock that came about, and
Hmm.
and it's important that people know that country music had a strong, like trust me, we didn't have a number one song in Convoy for a reason, you know. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I am. That's the one where he's constantly on the truck radio.
Right.
Boy, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
because CB culture became huge in the 70s, thanks to Smokey and the Bandit and stuff like that.
Right.
We got stuff like the Dukes of Hazzard, but Convoy became a huge crossover hit because people were buying CB radios.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to mention that country was pretty big back then. And,
yeah.
But what I think in the 70s is we saw a lot more crossover with it, and people flirting with it. And as I said, in the 80s, it really disappeared, and then resurged thanks to in the 90s. But to the 70s, you know, like Kenny Rogers was a superstar, and his stuff was unapologetic, like it wasn't trying to be pop. The early Kenny Rogers stuff was very country, like Lady, Howard of the County, and The Gambler. But people were listening to it, like people were buying it and stuff like that. And, you know, it wouldn't be weird to see a Kenny Rogers album right next to Billy Joel or stuff like that. And Barry Manilow.
Yeah. Oh, it's certainly, and I think that's one thing is you're seeing so many different genres becoming, all being accepted side by side, as you're putting it. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly what made the Eagles, you know, with Take It Easy and even stuff like Lion Eyes and all that. And even into, I mentioned Neil Young earlier as well. Certainly a strong country influence. Linda Ronstadt as well.
Yep. Sweet Home Alabama could easily be a country song. Lynyrd Skynyrd. That could easily sound like a country song, but it was also a thing. Early Doobie Brothers, before they were one of those groups that changed their when Michael McDonald showed up, because they were, of course, you know, like
Blackwater, yeah,
right. And then once they did What a Fool Believes, where they went out and out pop and started selling millions and won the Grammy. That's when they changed. And
well, I would say Taking It to the Streets would have been the changing point, actually. I think that came first, but yeah.
It did. But what Taking It to the Streets, yeah, because that was Michael McDonald still. But what I'm saying is, if you think of the song What a Fool Believes, it kind of almost has an R&B feel to it.
Totally.
When you listen to, like, you just mentioned Blackwater. When you listen to that, it's almost like these are the two same.
This is the same band.
Yeah, and that song was like, and it's funny how a lot of groups fought this. Like Styx was a really great rockin' band who did like concept albums and stuff, and then Dennis DeYoung wanted to introduce Babe, and the band was so against it, and the record company was like, Babe went on to be sell millions. It became one of their biggest hits, and the group still to this day look at Babe as if it was like, well, we like the money, but it changed our fans a little bit. And when Dennis DeYoung wanted to add more ballads, they were like, well, we're not Barry Manilow. We don't want to go in that direction. We want to be rockers, but you know, throw in a good ballad now and again. It doesn't hurt. Kiss did that with Death, so.
Oh, well, that's another great example. But also, you know, I was recently hearing an interview about the Guess Who, and that was a battle. They wanted to do more American Woman type songs, but the record label wanted Laughing and what was Undone, which one of the best songs of that era for sure.
Yeah, and I think there are times that the record industry does get involved. I've watched so many documentaries that have changed the course of groups, and it's surprising the ones that actually fought it. Even though it was great success for them, they were still like, well, we were happy doing that. You know, like you look at Heart in the 70s, to Heart in the 80s, and you can definitely tell the record company turned them kind of into like glam pop.
Oh, true, because they went from
were rockers in the, you know, Crazy on You and
but they went from that to what was their big What About Love? I think was one.
What About Love? These Dreams, Alone.
They had a duet with, I think, Loverboy or something later.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, they did Almost
Mm.
Paradise from
Hmm.
Footloose. That was, yeah, Ann Wilson
Yeah.
and Mike Reno. Yeah, the two leads from the group. But it's almost like day and night, you know.
Hmm.
And there, to me, I love all the songs. You could say that also about Chicago.
Great example. And Chicago. Actually, this is also an interesting point. I did want to sort of talk a bit about the jazz part of the 70s of
Yeah, well, I
Chicago.
hope so. You're the jazz guy.
And it was not a great, especially the first part of the decade, was not great for jazz purists, so to speak. Um, in the 50s and into the both middle of the 60s, jazz, you had some of the greatest jazz releases in history.
Mhm.
By the early 70s, interestingly, it was more, a lot of those jazz artists were now playing and performing with rock bands and with pop artists.
Why do
Uh,
you think jazz kind of lost its flair in the 70s?
I've heard some theories. Part of it was actually it was starting to happen in the mid to late 60s, because jazz, when you think about it, it's the whole idea of it was listened to more in terms of albums and those who were really into the music, right?
Right.
Well, suddenly now you've got incredible albums by the Beatles, like Abbey Road, who came out near the end of the 60s. You've got The Doors, hence your shirt, who was, again, who were all, actually had a very strong jazz influence. You had the Moody Blues and all that incredible stuff that was drawing attention away from genres like jazz. So
And you have
interestingly,
to,
yeah.
well, I was just going to say, I'm not trying to be an old fuddy duddy, but if I have to step in those shoes, a lot of people, rock and roll did shake up a lot of things. Like a
Hmm.
lot of styles of music kind of started fading away because rock and roll, starting with Elvis and right into like the Beatles era, and we started losing a lot of genres of music. It was
Very
still
true.
out there, yeah. Like, and so I wonder if jazz was kind of lost in that, which is funny because jazz is an inspiration for a lot of people. Do you think Chicago, the early stuff, is because I listen to it and I think that's very jazzy?
Oh, absolutely. You put on their first couple albums. I guess you could
Mhm.
say, with Does Anybody Know What Time It Is? You
Yeah,
listen to a song like that, or a song like Beginnings, for example, or a
Old
Saturday in the
Days.
Park, sort of,
Yeah,
and getting a little more toward pop, but I love that song anytime.
yeah. Make Me
Um,
Smile.
Make Me
Yeah, so many
Smile.
great. Yeah.
Make Me Smile
I
is a
just
great
discovered
example.
Old Days, which is a
Oh,
great old track that I love.
absolutely. So they certainly started in that foundation, but also you look at more Canadian examples like Lighthouse.
You know what? Yeah, nice.
They're a jazz band to me,
Hmm.
uh, and s-
Absolutely, yeah. One Fine Morning and stuff with the. I did get the right song there, did I? One
One
of them.
Fine Morning is a perfect
Yeah,
example.
that. Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
you can hear it in their music because
mhm,
there's a lot of. I don't know how to say it. There's a lot of horns. There's a lot of drums, like cymbals.
mhm.
Is that what it's called?
There's
Which I
percussion,
play
yeah.
percussion. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. But it's the metal. Yeah, I hear a lot of that in there. But yeah,
um,
I think yeah, I think maybe rock and roll it was a good thing, but I'm glad jazz has kind of found its place. People finding the love for that again. But I think sometimes it's a good thing when groups like some people like I don't like 80s Chicago, but I think it was probably smart for them to adapt,
okay.
you know? Because it's one thing to be critically acclaimed, but when they hit the 80s and they started just doing adult contemporary type stuff, they were making money and they were still getting played on the radio. And
Mhm.
I think that always leads you to their old catalog.
That's a great theory because now those new fans will go back and listen to 25 or 6 to 4 and stuff
And
like that.
and
Yeah.
this is from experience because if
Uh-huh.
you asked me Chicago, I'd be thinking hard to say I'm sorry
Right.
when I was a kid. And then I realized, oh, that song, do you know what time it is? That's Chicago too, Saturday in the
Mm-hmm.
Park. And
Mm-hmm.
that would blow me away because it's almost like two totally different groups. But I always, and I hope more people are like this, and I think people are getting that way, to go find out their
Mm-hmm.
earlier stuff. You know, I'm a huge Olivia Newton-John fan, but I know her from Grease and Xanadu and Physical. When I got into her, I didn't realize she had this huge career in country music in the 70s, and she was one of the crossover acts she had number one songs on the pop chart and on the country chart because she had that. And she also was part of something else I'd like to bring up about
Mm-hmm.
the 70s is when we talked about, so we don't make rock and roll sound too bad because it isn't, but well, you might not remember this, but in the 70s, there was a huge 50s resurgence.
Happy Days.
Happy Days, American Graffiti, Grease.
Mm-hmm.
And Grease is funny because I always loved the Grease soundtrack because Grease has songs that sound like the 50s, but they
Totally.
blatantly have songs that sound like the 70s. And I love that they're unapologetic about that. You know, You're the One That I Want does
Yes.
not sound like a song that came out in the 50s, but it sort of does.
But then you put on, oh gosh, I forget the name of it now. It'll come to me. Summer Nights.
Summer Nights.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And great, like a big part of and people were, I remember even being growing up in the 70s, people were starting to listen to oldies stations and
Right.
they would play 50s because the 60s wasn't considered old in the 70s. So you'd be hearing all the and all that kind of stuff. And
Uh-huh.
it was kind of like, okay, it's resurgence. And I think a big part of that too, see if you agree with me, is another style that we have to mention in the 70s. We're never going to get everything in here, but I love it. Is punk rock.
Yes. With
Started in the
yep.
70s. Well, it started in the 60s, but it became more mainstream. And the
Mm-hmm.
reason I bring it up is because I remember, I'm a huge Ramones fan. I
Mm-hmm.
call them out. The Ramones said that they got together, and the reason they did was they were going to be the answer to prog rock. Where progressive
Mm-hmm.
rock, you'd listen to a song for 17 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to go back to the 50s
Mm-hmm.
where they did songs that would get everything you need to say in 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
Well, an interesting connection again from the 50s to the end of the 70s. There was I was listening the other day to a song, "At the Hop" by Danny and the Juniors.
Yep, yeah. Huge
Put
song.
that next to a Ramones song,
Yep.
and you
And
see where they're getting their inspiration.
right. And if you actually look at early Ramones songs, they
Hmm.
remade a lot of 50s and 60s songs, like the
Right.
early 60s. Do You Want to Dance? And I can't remember any of them, but they did a lot. Baby, I Love You, or I can't remember.
Hmm.
Baby, I Love You. They did a lot of that, and a lot of their stuff, like you said, Blitzkrieg Bop and Are You
"Baby,
Being.
I Love You" wasn't that was I always think of Andy Kim singing that.
Yeah, he had a version of that too.
Yeah, that's
A
right.
couple people did it, but they
Hmm.
did a lot of 50s and 60s remakes
Hmm.
in on their albums. And but they did say that the reason they did it was because, and the Ramones and the Sex Pistols, those are
Hmm.
two groups that are constantly mentioned of groundbreaking and bringing punk mainstream. I always thought it was fun that a group like the Monkees, I heard one person say that their song "I'm Not Your Stepping Stone" is
It's punk.
considered to a
Oh
lot
yeah.
of punk fans
Uh-huh.
to be one of the earliest punk songs because
Totally.
even though it's played for pop, I
Hmm.
think the Sex Pistols actually redid it, and it
They
actually,
covered it. Yeah.
yeah, and it sounds like a punk song. And
Hmm.
it's funny because the Monkees never get the love. I could do a whole show on the Monkees because they had so much good music, but they just always got grouped into, like, you're not a real band, you're not a real
Yeah.
band stuff. But the 1950s feel of the 70s, I think punk helped a lot of that too because it kind of set that up. And of course, punk in some ways set up how they kind of ended the decade, which was new wave
New
started showing.
wave was just starting to happen. That's right.
Right. And new wave, basically a lot of people think of it 80s, but it was definitely starting
Hmm.
late 70s.
The
And I always thought
Cars.
it was,
Yeah.
yeah, the Cars, absolutely. I always think it's funny that Blondie was a new wave group, but
Hmm.
the song that broke them was a disco song, Heart
Heart
of
of Glass. Yeah.
yeah, which is blatantly. And I also found out that Heart of Glass was released like 3, 4 times and flopped every time until
Oh.
somebody just said, just make it a disco song. And they did, and it finally hit. But that song, they apparently there are versions that you can go listen to that show different styles of how they originally wanted it to be.
I got to
And they
hear
could never
this.
get it right. But they basically made it sound like we have faith in this song. And then somebody just said,
Mm.
just go full on disco and do it. And, as much as I know some people that say, Heart of Glass is the first new wave #1 song, but I'm like, no, so that is disco. They did have new wave hits, and I do rank Blondie, but Blondie is one of those groups that are like, to me, like David Bowie. They
Hmm.
changed so often. And they had such a short career. But even by the fact that every album they were trying different things. They did Rapture, throw in some early rap
Absolutely.
in
That
a
was a
pop
highly
song.
influential song.
And
Hmm.
then you have The Tide is High that has some
Hmm.
ska feeling to it and
Yeah.
stuff. And that blew me away because I didn't know that was a remake of an old 60s song.
Okay.
And because I always thought, hey, that was it. So New Wave definitely started in that. And I think that was what basically led to what we started seeing in the 80s,
Hmm.
the beginning of the 80s, where you'd have a couple things drift over. But yeah, wow. It was a great decade, wasn't it?
Well, and I know a few other things that we should quickly get to
Sure,
from
absolutely.
that era, just to do it some justice.
Yeah.
Uh, um, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye,
Oh,
you know, just certainly a definitive part of the whole decade.
absolutely. Did we mention Donna Summer, the Queen of Disco? Got to mention her.
She was the first 45 you bought, Last Dance.
That's how we mentioned her. But we've
But
also got to remember
I
that
Feel Love.
I Feel Love, yes, which was what is considered, I might be wrong about this, but a lot of people consider that Georgia Moroder produced the first beginnings of house music. Is that correct? You agree with me on that?
Totally, it was so ahead of its time.
It was. And it's funny because it was grouped in just disco.
Wow.
And then when you look at it, it's like, no, 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 that was huge. And people look at it now going, yeah, it was, yeah, there's something even as a kid, I remember it didn't feel like Bad Girls or on the radio. I loved all that stuff, but I
Mhm.
Feel Love had its own like niche to it. I was also probably, it was a very sexy song too, like,
Mhm.
and I wasn't used to hearing that. I'm actually going to mention I love that there was some weird stuff that happened in the 70s too. That, as I said, I wish we had more time to talk because I love the see. As I said, when I listen to a top 40
Mhm.
uh, thing, what you get is like you're listening to the Eagles and you're listening to the Jacksons and you're listening to stuff. But then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a religious song can be one of the biggest songs of the year. You Light Up My
Okay.
Life by Debbie Boone, the
Right.
most innocent song. And I think people didn't know she was talking about God
Hmm.
because that song was huge and it's looked upon now as like, oh, what a like what a sappy song. But I love that for a moment in time, this was like the big, like it stayed at the
Hmm.
top of the charts for weeks. And it was this song about this woman declaring her love for God. But I think most young lovers thought it was she was
Well,
talking about her boyfriend or something. But it was such a I love when songs can do that. And so here we have Disco Duck, and then we're going to hear Debbie Boone next, you know.
Right. Or I'm trying to remember the name of the artist, but Lovin' You,
Oh, Minnie Riperton.
Minnie Riperton.
Riperton,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. Oh, what a song. Oh, and yeah, just so many great songs. And uh, yeah, Captain and Tennille, like
Yeah.
such a pop group that gave us some wonderful songs, like you know, Love Will Keep Us Together, and oh, Do That to Me One More Time, and even like stuff like Muskrat Love, which is, how did that become a hit single? And I love it. When those little muskrats. Are you familiar with Muskrat Love?
Who was the artist?
Captain and Tennille.
Okay. Okay. I have
They
to
had a
refresh it.
song. They had a song called Muskrat Love that was a top 40 single. You need to hear this, because the fact that this was a top 40 single is incredible. Um, Again, the Captain and Tennille was a huge duo at the time, and they were a married couple. And Love Will Keep Us Together just became one of the biggest songs in 1975. And Muskrat Love is this song literally about two muskrats falling in love. But what's awesome about it is Daryl Dragon, who is one of the, I consider one of the greatest synthesizer players, pianists, and he doesn't get the love. He played with on some Beach Boys tracks, but he just doesn't get the respect. He literally has moments in this song where the muskrats are talking to one another, and it's just like,
Wow.
you got to hear this song, and you got to imagine this was playing while we were listening to Queen
Uh-huh.
and Elton John, and here's Muskrat Love, this thing that you mention it now, and you'll see people going, you know.
Wow.
Same with a song like Afternoon Delight.
Starland Vocal Band.
Right,
Yeah.
a group that was praised to be the next big thing, and they had a one-hit wonder, and it was such a sweet, sappy song that was about having sex in the afternoon. And it was lovely because it was this edgy, sexy topic, but it was done like you could sing it like
It's
at
a little
church.
afternoon delight, you know?
Yes. Sky rockets in flight. So it was such a fun decade, like, and just, yeah, I wish we could. We'll have to break it down in years or something one time. Just
We can talk for a bit longer. It's fine.
Yeah, sweet. Okay, I didn't know if you had to go.
We can go a little longer for sure.
Yeah, let's talk, because I'm sure there's some artists we haven't hit. I actually have. Yeah, we probably haven't mentioned half these people. I think you mentioned Pink Floyd.
Yeah.
But Led Zeppelin.
Yes.
We did hit a little bit on Fleetwood Mac, but they were huge. And from what I hear, the Rumors album, I watched this guy who owns a record shop. He has trouble keeping that album in because people want that album so
I think it ranks near the top of the albums that are being bought today.
Yes, yes.
Definitely
That's
in the
what he
top
said.
5.
Like, when
Yeah.
he gets a copy of Rumors in,
Uh-huh.
it's gone within a few hours that he puts it out, because yeah, it's a wonderful little YouTube channel where he has his own store and he talks music, but he's like, some albums I can't keep, and Rumors is one of them. Like, people just love it, and it's a great album. It was so different.
And almost every song was a hit.
There was a lot.
I think there was a few exceptions, but most of it was all hits.
Yeah, and they, what I liked about the Fleetwood Mac, Fleetwood Mac, is that they were kind of diverse. You'd have Lindsey Buckingham doing stuff like Go Your Own Way and Don't Stop, but then you'd have the ladies singing like Dreams and stuff like that. Yeah. And their vocals were wonderful. So with Fleetwood Mac, you'd sometimes get a male artist, you get a female artist, but it was all great stuff. And as I said, they had an earlier career of stuff like that. Meatloaf, Bad Out of Hell. Gotta mention that album.
Okay.
I don't know if you're a fan of that album.
There was certainly, oh gosh, the one with the baseball game going on.
Paradise by the Dashboard
Paradise
Light.
by the Dashboard Light.
Love it. Love it.
That certainly is. I consider it a guilty pleasure, but I just love it every time I put it on. Yeah.
And you put that on in a crowded room, and people love it.
Yeah.
And it was one of the few songs that was 8 minutes that still played on top 40
Yeah.
radio.
That
They
was
did
rare.
not have an edited version. It was
Mhm.
like when you heard it, they played all of it.
Mhm.
And you didn't get that too often. It had to be good songs. So songs like Bohemian Rhapsody, which was close to six, and other stuff like being growing up, Queen. I remember when I hear "We Will Rock You" sometimes on the radio,
Sure.
and when it finishes and goes into another song, I'm always like,
Wait a minute.
yeah,
Something's missing here.
because here in Canada and in other places,
Mhm.
"We Will Rock You" always goes into "We Are the Champions." It was
Oh, it
released
has to.
as a
Yeah.
double song, and it's
Mhm.
weird when you listen to them separate because to me it just doesn't feel right.
Yep, they have always gone together, and you saw that actually quite a bit with some other songs of that time as well. Now that I think about it, yeah, that was
Uh,
done quite a bit.
and us all being Canadian, we need to
Hmm.
mention some Canadian artists of the
Yes,
70s because you mentioned Lighthouse and Guess Who, but we also
BTO,
had
yeah,
Gordon Lightfoot
Gordon
and
Lightfoot.
Joni Mitchell and Anne
Hmm.
Murray. And
Yes.
people put down Anne Murray, but I think she has a beautiful collection of music and you really have to go and listen to some of her early stuff to
Hmm.
really find some gems, but she has some good music and
Oh, totally. She her cover of Danny's song, uh,
oh, yeah,
which I
absolutely.
believe was by Kenny Loggins and Messina before.
Right, right. And it was a kind of like a college radio hit for them, and she
Hmm.
actually turned it into a big hit for them.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
and but definitely she doesn't get enough love. A lot of people, Gordon Lightfoot, he deserves all the credit he
Totally.
gets, and Joni Mitchell, like these people are groundbreaking people. These are like artists from all over the world will go and say, I was inspired by Gordon Lightfoot. I was inspired by Joni Mitchell. So yeah, you definitely have to bring them into the thing. How about a little artist that had major success in the 70s and then really didn't make it go anywhere, like Peter Frampton?
Frampton Comes Alive.
Right, one of the
Yep.
few people that actually their biggest selling album was like a live album, and it was like live albums really, I think, I don't know, there was probably a lot of, did they do a lot of live jazz albums in the 50s and 60s?
That was a thing. I don't think those would necessarily be. Yeah, that certainly was a thing.
But it wasn't.
But I don't think it was necessarily. Um, Again, maybe in this same idea that we're talking about here, where because I know of what you're talking about with Peter Frampton. I think they released all those songs, and they didn't go anywhere. Then they
Yeah,
did It Comes Alive, and suddenly it
right.
was I think one of the best selling albums of the whole decade, or
Yeah, he
close to
did
it.
really good with it.
Hmm.
And he never was able to follow it up. Of course, he did follow it up with doing a really bad movie, which
Okay.
didn't help them. He did the Sergeant Pepper and the Lonely Hearts Club Band,
Hmm.
which on paper, having Peter Frampton and the Bee Gees singing Beatles songs might have
Hmm.
looked good. I still enjoy the movie, but yeah, it's bad.
Okay.
Jorda's laughing because she knows I've made her watch it a couple times. It's not a good movie, but
Hmm.
there's some interesting musical choices in there. But live albums, I think, really took off in the 70s because another
Okay.
group that I just watched a thing that I did not know about, Kiss actually had a couple of failed albums before Kiss Alive got
Right.
them big,
Okay.
because they were a big group and they toured and everybody loved their show. And every time they released an album, the singles just fell flat, including Rock and Roll All Night,
Hmm.
which didn't do that well on the charts originally. And then what happened was they were lucky because Casablanca, who were their record label, they were basically struggling until disco really helped them because they had Donna Summers and a couple of like Village People and stuff. And Kiss was on Casablanca, and it was like, we don't know what to do with Kiss. They've had three
Hmm.
flop albums or something like that.
Hmm.
And the guy who signed them was like, we got to do something. And they go, okay, they sell out all their concerts. They just
Hmm.
can't hit the top 40. So he decided, let's put out a live album. And then suddenly the live version of Rock and Roll All Night started getting airplay
So
and
so so
started,
so 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 that was what was the big hit then at the time. The live
yes,
version. Okay.
the live version, but it got people also to start playing the non-live version because
Okay.
people
Wow.
were like, "Oh, that's a good song," but they released that and it didn't do very well, like at
Interesting.
all. And then when they put the live version, College played it, and then Top 40 played it, and then suddenly they were starting to get play, and then they did Beth, which kind of,
Hmm.
okay, now they're versatile. They got their
Hmm.
love ballad, and then that's when they started blowing up, and then the whole Kiss army was huge in the 70s. That we definitely still have to talk about because that was something really huge too. I love that, like, the Beatles phenomenon and Elvis phenomenon started breaking out with, like we talked about, the Bay City Rollers, and even if it was short lived, it's nice when they get to that manic state. And I remember my brother and his friends were like, "We're part of the Kiss Army" and stuff, which is
Nice.
funny because
Yeah.
I'm going to call my brother out, but most people know he was a big Barry Manilow fan, but he was
Oh,
still,
cool.
I like Kiss too, and stuff like that. And I consider Barry Manilow
Well,
one of
Barry
the
Manilow, I believe he reached his peak in the mid 70s, if I'm not mistaken.
absolutely,
His
yeah.
commercial peak.
He started in the early 70s, and
Hmm.
he was big all through the 70s. And he, I think people are starting to, like, because he kind of got a stigma about him. In the 80s and 90s, if you were a Barry Manilow fan, you were looked down upon. And I know this from experience because Corda's mother was
Hmm.
a member of a Barry Manilow fan club, right? Like a Hamilton chapter, a Burlington chapter. Am I right?
Wow.
Yeah,
I
true.
met many of her friends through the Barry Manilow fan club.
Oh, there was a fan club. Wow.
Heather and I would not have met if it wasn't for Barry Manilow,
Oh,
because
nice.
my brother and sister-in-law at the time were waiting in line for tickets, and they actually met Heather, Corda's mother, and they got talking, and they joined the fan club and became really great friends. And then I met Corda through that. So we always joke that Barry Manilow brought us all together.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
When music make you, you make friends through it and all that? Yeah.
And like that was another, like, Barry was part of another group. He kind of like
Uh-huh.
doesn't really, people don't group him in with like James Taylor, and even though he was adult contemporary, he's kind of more grouped in with Neil Diamond and
Hmm.
Neil Sedaka, who are another
Mm.
kind of thing. Even like Captain and Tennille, which was kind of like
Hmm.
pop, adult contemporary kind of thing. But Barry did write a lot of his songs. Ironically, he did not write his biggest song, "I Write the Songs," uh, which makes me laugh all the time because he had the big hit with it, but it was actually, I believe, written by, I want to say, one of the non-Wilson members of the Beach Boys. Sorry,
Oh,
got so many B's.
oh, was it?
Um,
Okay.
and he wrote it, and a couple other people recorded it, but Barry made it. And to this day, I think people still think Barry Manilow wrote "I Write the Songs." No, he wrote a lot of his own songs, but some of his biggest were actually remakes. Mandy was a song called Brandy. Um,
Okay.
and he changed a letter and got a number one song out of it and
Hmm.
stuff. And I think people like, I think like Neil Diamond has always gotten respect in his music, but I think Barry has had to work for it. But
Okay.
I now meet people that are not afraid to say, you know what, Barry Manilow had some good songs. And when you actually go listen to like his greatest hits, you're actually surprised how many you would know and stuff like that. I was talking recently to my brother, who's a big Barry Manilow fan, and he said the song he actually is not a big fan of with Barry Manilow is probably one that people know him for, Copacabana. And he said he just doesn't like it because it's so overplayed,
For
but it
sure.
was
Yeah.
cool.
Hmm.
And again, here's Barry with this big hit song that doesn't fit with any other style that's being played on the radio, but we're loving it. You know, I don't think we heard a Copacabana type song until the 80s when Miami Sound Machines started coming in with conga, you know,
Okay.
where we got
Yeah.
the Latin rhythms and stuff. And here's this white Jewish boy, you know, doing Copacabana and turning it into a big hit. Another person I want to mention for the
Mhm.
70s, because I never really knew how big he was because he only had a couple of hit songs, but he has some of the most fanatical fans. Jimmy Buffett.
Margaritaville and Come Monday and
Yes,
yeah, for sure.
right. And he had a
Parrot
couple of
Heads.
hits. Yeah, Parrot Heads. Yet you still get people who go down to see him
Hmm.
perform these songs, and he's still. I know he's done a lot of duets in the
Hmm.
country genre, and I
Right.
love the Cheeseburger in Paradise, which,
Hmm.
if you do know that song,
Yep.
if you're listening and don't know that song, go listen to it because Margarita is a classic, but Cheeseburger in Paradise is one of the strangest top 40 songs you'll
Hmm.
ever hear, and I love it. And it's just so much fun. But yeah, Jimmy Buffett, he almost has his own little niche in
It's
there.
it's 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 he almost has his own genre in a
Yeah,
sense.
yeah. And I didn't realize,
Yeah.
like when I was growing up, I just Margaritaville and a couple other songs, Come
Hmm.
Monday, you know. And then when I got older, I met some parrot heads, and
Hmm.
I looked into it, and I couldn't believe what a ravenous fan club he has. And I'm like, you know, power to you that you did that. So yeah, great stuff. Any other artists that we did not pay tribute to? Oh, I was also groups that really made a dent in the 70s, but really only a little bit was like Boston.
Boston.
Their
Yes.
debut album is considered to be one of the greatest albums ever made. Like
Yeah.
I watched some people talk about it. I've
Hmm.
been watching a lot of music
Hmm.
channels, and even Boston said that they were so intricate that they knew they were making something really special. But they said it took them a long time. That album
Hmm.
took a long time. And then they had their follow up, Don't Look Back. And then I think it took like almost 10 years before they followed that up in the late 80s with Third Stage.
Was that what had
Because,
Amanda on it?
pardon?
That had Amanda on it, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
Amanda, yeah,
Hmm.
Can't You Say You Believe in Me and stuff.
Hmm.
But Boston was so influential for just having those two albums, and then
Hmm.
eventually they released some other stuff. But they were so meticulous that, yeah, that they kind of got there eventually. But they were such perfectionists, and I love hearing that. And then there's other groups that were kind of like what I call, what are they? They're sort of like super groups, but they were made up of artists that were studio musicians, like Toto,
Right.
like basically just groups like, hey, let's see what happens when we all get together. You know, Alan Parsons Project,
Hmm.
that really didn't peak until the 80s, but they were doing this great prog rock in the 70s,
Yeah.
and then
The
they're,
uh
yeah,
I was just in a
and
car.
Alan Parsons, sorry, go ahead.
I was just Alan Parsons. I was just revisiting the iRobot,
Yes,
which they
yes,
had, and there's this one where they're reading The Raven, which the famous poem by Edgar Allan Poe.
right, they did that, yeah.
Uh-huh.
And I just watched an interview with him, and he said, yeah, when I look back at it, he goes, I know it's revered. And he said, and he goes, he felt that they lucked out because a lot of artists were being pushed to go in different directions, but they chose the directions they were going to do because they went mainstream about 79, 80 when they were releasing stuff like
Eye in the Sky.
Games People
Mhm.
Play, Time. But they said that they never, because he was already an established producer, their record company never pushed them because they said it would be, that I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but it would be insulting to say we want you to be produced by somebody else. And so Alan Parsons is one of those few artists that said, I have never been produced by anyone else but myself.
Right, because he
And he
produced
said
Dark Side of the Moon, for example.
he did, and
Hmm.
he also was on one of the last Beatles albums, but he was
Right.
only he wasn't, he learned from it. He wasn't like, he said, I did nothing on those albums that I can get credit for, but I
Mhm.
got to watch it being put together. And he goes, if
Mhm.
you want a lesson, the fact that I was called in to do that. And so, the fact he was said that his Alan Parsons project was kind of left alone because they said, I think I had made a reputation that it would almost be insulting to say, well, we would like someone else to produce you. And he goes, so I never got that. But he said, I heard other artists. He said he worked with a group from the 70s that did prog rock, Ambrosia.
Okay, they had like one major hit, I think.
They had a couple of
Couple.
hits
Hmm.
when they went to adult contemporary. They did How Much I Feel and They're the Biggest Part of Me,
Hmm.
a group that I absolutely love, but I didn't actually know they had this progressive rock, and I guess
Oh,
Alan Parsons
wow.
worked with them.
Hmm.
And he actually said he thought they were one of the greatest groups around, but didn't get the love. He said their prog rock stuff, good, but by their third album, their record company was turning the screws and saying, we need some radio hits, and that's
Hmm.
when How Much I Feel. So when you listen to that, we're listening into another. Actually, oh my God, we almost forgot a genre that I've just learned it actually has a name.
Okay.
Have you heard the term yacht rock?
Oh, I certainly have. Yes.
I did not know there
Yeah.
was a term for this, and this started in the 70s because
Oh.
we're talking Kenny Loggins, we're
Hmm.
talking Christopher Cross in his
Hmm.
like early days. Lots of early artists. I think even Jackson Brown kind of
Okay.
fits there a little bit. And it's kind of like it's rock, but it's feel good adult contemporary as well. It could fit into that.
Hmm.
And I just heard the term yacht rock and I had to find out what is yacht rock. And I
Hmm.
realized, yeah, I'd listen to this stuff. I just didn't know
Mm.
it had a thing. I guess like Eddie Money might fit in there as well, like Two Tickets to Paradise and
Hmm.
Baby Hold On and stuff. But yeah, oh, what a great decade. Well, I think we have talked about a lot of stuff, and I think we could go on for hours, but we're going to wrap it up. How do you feel about? Does this make you want to just go out and listen to some 70s? I know you're going to run to listen to Muskrat Love. I know.
Yeah, now with all this, we got to now go and listen to all the good stuff now.
Yeah, I know. I'm actually
Yeah.
looking forward to doing another 70s time warp soon. I know I have a
Cool.
60s one coming up, but 70s will be back again for sure. But yeah, are you comfortable coming on talking about other decades? 'Cause I think it's fun.
Absolutely. Yep. Anytime.
Because, as much as we talk about the 70s, the 80s, the
Hmm.
60s had a lot of great stuff. And, oh, yeah. So if you're watching this right now, do yourself a favor. And hopefully people were jotting down things that either they never heard of before or they want to go re-listen to, because that's always fun too. Like, oh, like if we mention something like, oh, I haven't listened to Boston in ages, or Barry Manilow or something, definitely do that, because we need as much music as we can during stuff like that. What have you been listening to a lot lately? It doesn't have to be the 70s to get you through this pandemic, like in the last week.
Yeah. Well, in the
Put
last,
you on the spot here.
it's yeah. I think that again, it varies from week to week. The last few days, I've kind of been in and out of the '80s personally. I
Mhm.
will say. So it
Now,
just depends. Yeah.
I do have to ask you one 80s question. I know we're trying
Sure.
to languish in the
Hmm.
70s, but I feel I may have traumatized you,
Okay.
and I want to make sure you're okay. Because in
Okay.
this pandemic, you got to check on people.
Sure. Sure.
You mentioned that I may have traumatized you by showing you the video you might think by the Cars that you had never seen before until I showed it at, I think was it the 80s time warp or a dance party?
I
And
think it
you
might have.
said,
Yeah.
yeah, go on.
I'm trying to remember now what it would have been. It might have been a dance party. I think, yeah, it was You Might Think, wasn't it? The one where
It
the
was.
big,
And you
the
mentioned
eye.
it came up,
Yeah.
you listened to it, and then you told me that all you could think of was that video. And I said, you had never seen that video before?
I can't unsee that now.
You know that
It's
video.
that video is now etched in, to my yeah. It's one of those videos that you hear the song. It's now You can't unsee this stuff.
Do you realize how groundbreaking that video was considered when it came
Hmm.
out? Like, it actually won the best video at the MTV Video Awards, like the ultimate prize.
Wow.
And there's two versions of it, actually.
Hmm.
And I probably showed you the most traumatizing one because there's one where he touches his glasses and pulls his face off, and then all the stuff in the video comes down. And then
Right.
there's one where he just touches the glass and there's no face opening. But I think the face one. So I hope I didn't ruin that song for you.
Another new visual for me.
I love that I keep teaching you things, like even if
Yeah.
it's traumatizing things. Why don't you give Jazz in Session another plug before we leave here?
I can do that. Yes, so please join me Wednesday mornings from 10 till noon, either on 101.5 The Hawk in Hamilton or at CFRU 93.3 in Guelph. And don't worry if you're new to jazz, we don't get into the crazy fusion stuff. Most of the time we don't go there. We cover all eras, and we also look at artists who might have been influenced by jazz as well. So even a few weeks ago, just as a quick example, I played Groove is in the Heart by Delight.
Nice.
And that's because it samples Herbie Hancock, a great jazz artist. I've got Dr. John, great artist from the 70s, coming up this week. So do check it out. Don't feel like if you're not already a big jazz aficionado, we'll welcome you, and you'll discover something that you enjoy.
Yeah, I found the times I've listened to it,
Mm-hmm.
I've actually found it's a great introduction
Mm-hmm.
to jazz, because you do play a variety, but you also, I like what I love about your show is that you, like you said, you show influences of it, like
Mm-hmm.
Groove is in the Heart and stuff like that. Stuff that I listen to, that I remember we talked about Coop, and I was a big
Yes.
fan of the song Summer Sun, and I always loved it when I heard it, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to mention, well, yeah, it's definitely got jazz. And I never
Mm-hmm.
thought of that before because, again, I'm kind of like music is music, but I'm getting to the point of learning and stuff. And I love that that whole album is very jazzy and stuff like that. And yeah, it's a great gateway drug, we'll call it, to learning about jazz. And I know jazz can be intimidating because I started having a love affair with jazz later in life. And when you go starting to look, there's so many foxholes you can go down.
Mm-hmm.
And I think your show is a great way of, because sometimes you're overwhelmed. If you even go to YouTube or like
Mm-hmm.
a Spotify or something like that, and you take jazz, well, you're going to be hit with everything because there's so many styles and I don't know where to begin. So I think your show is amazing because it is a great way. Now, is it, can you only watch it at that time or can you listen to old shows or?
Now it's all available to stream on demand. If you simply go to
Nice.
either of the radio stations like 1015thehawk.ca, click under archives, and all our shows are listed there. Just click on whatever show you'd like to listen back to, and all the shows are available to stream anytime.
Perfect. I'm glad I mentioned it because, yeah, because then people can catch up and they don't have to wait till Wednesday. They can
Exactly.
listen to your show right now. Anyhow, Kareem, thank you for coming on the show. We're going to have you back.
Thank
Maybe
you.
we'll have to talk the other decades and stuff. And it was so much fun. And it's incredible. I almost want to go back and make a list of, because I think we hit a lot in this short period.
We did really
And
good.
and we'll still later tonight we're gonna hear a song and go, I can't believe we didn't mention that. But it would almost be fun to see just how many artists we mentioned in this timeline. So
We did really
I
well.
hate to do that.
We
We've never done.
covered so much, so that was awesome.
We did. Anyhow, you have a great night.
You
Thank you,
too.
Courtney. You gotta learn not to talk so much when we have guests. She loves just listening. She is so happy when we have guests
Oh yeah, I
because
just
she gets to be quiet and just watch and learn. But
it's perfect.
anyhow, Kareem, you have a great night. And thank you all for watching. It means so much. Please, we hope we inspired you to go listen to some 70s today. I don't care if it's disco, folk, the streak. I don't care. Just go listen to some music tonight, and it will put you in a better spot. It always does. Thank you.